Once again, my name is Brian Geary. I'm Communications Director at Pearson College. My guest today is Dr. Deborah Saucier, the President and Vice-Chancellor of Vancouver Island University. Now, she's a PC Year 10, that's 1985, originally from Saskatchewan. She's also a PhD in psychology and an academic and research. She has had an academic and research career, continues to have, which includes serving as a Canada Research Chair in behavioural neuroscience. So with that, I'm intimidated, but I'm very happy to speak with you, and very happy that you could take the time to speak with
Oh,
us.
thank you for inviting me. There's an old joke in psychology where people are like, I'm a little bit intimidated, and the answer is yes, and I'm quite worried about you too.
Perfect.
Yeah. No, not really. I'm not that kind
I
of a
know.
psychologist.
Yeah. Well, let's start off with talking about how things are going recently. Now, you started your position as president of VIU, and we'll talk about the university itself in a moment. I think in July 2019.
That's right. We're just
Yeah.
finishing. We're coming up to the end of my second year.
So you had a bit of non-COVID and COVID years. So how are you holding up during this very
Yeah.
strange year?
Well, it's a really strange time. We're coming up on the first anniversary of when I set the university on a new course with a week to pivot, as many folks had. We closed the university for a week so that folks could rearrange their teaching and their learning expectations, get home if they needed to, etc. And we're coming up to the first year anniversary of that in just a couple weeks. What's been great is the way in which our community is pulled together to really put the learners at the center of what we do. What's been hard is just the things we were speaking about earlier, which is the lack of contact and the lack of spontaneous contact. The other thing I would say is that VIU really prides itself on its focus on our learners, and so our faculty and our staff really get a lot of energy from interacting with students. And as you know from Zoom, it's not quite the same when all your students are like the size of a postage stamp to really get that energy and that vibe. But
Precisely.
again, I'm always amazed by the ways in which I hear our faculty are innovating and our staff are innovating to try and get those experiences for our learners.
Is most of your teaching online these days now at VIU?
So about 70% of our classes are fully online, which is a
Mhm.
huge shift for us because most of our classes prior to this were face-to-face. But we never actually closed. We have a number of programs that require internships, labs. We have the trades, as well as practical aspects. So about 30% of all of our course offerings have some face-to-face component and have had for ever since we started back in March on this path.
And a strange path it is, but just just bearing in mind that people we have alumni and others from around the world who are watching this interview. Can you just give us a brief primer on VIU? Just remind us of where it is, maybe in relation to the Pearson campus, and
Sure.
how many students you have, things like that.
Sure. Well, we are an access university and a regional university located in Nanaimo, BC. So for any of you folks who have gone skiing at Mount Washington, which is something we used to do, you would have had to have driven through Nanaimo. We're about an hour out of, oh, well, it took me, I had to go to Victoria the other day for business, and it took me about an hour and a half to get to downtown Victoria. So I would bet dollars to donuts, it would take me about an hour 45 to get to Pearson. So that's about where we are. That is assuming, because I haven't been any closer to Pearson than Woody's Lagoon in some time, that the roads are the same as they were. If they've put in a new superhighway, which I understand Langford is not the Langford I remember, that it may be a little faster. That being said, VIU really prides itself on being an access institution, and we offer everything from basic high school upgrading to master's degrees and anything in between, including basic science, baccalaureates, trades certificates, Red Seal training, and we really are proud of the way that we integrate and ladder all of those opportunities so that folks really have an opportunity to get the kind of education they want, whether that's the first time out or if it's coming back to reskill or upskill.
Hmm. And you do have a fair number of international students as well. And I say that with this in mind. I believe we have 3 students from Pearson, 3 alumni from Pearson who are attending VIU. And I think 2 of those are international students as well.
Yeah.
That cohort must have been affected by COVID.
Yeah, so that's really you know, a real loss of real vibrancy. On any given year, we have between 13 to 20% of our population being international, primarily in a few specific disciplines, which is interesting because, of course, our Canadian students also seem to want to study those things too, including management and the sciences. So those are really really popular with our international students. We have about prior to COVID, we had about between 1,700 and 1,800 international students from around the world. The biggest markets for international students or interest from international students are from places like China, India, Vietnam, but we've also just recently set up offices in South America. We have an office in Europe, and a number in Asia and Southeast Asia. And we're working on trying to promote our university in Africa. And we have strong partnerships through Canadian Institutes and Colleges Canada and Global Affairs Canada with a number of universities and polytechs in Africa as well. So it's a really rich piece of work that we have with our international students. Our international students bring a global perspective to Nanaimo, and many of our learners, you know, until they have met with international students, may not have seen themselves as leaving Canada to get a global experience. And so that's a really important aspect, I think, for Canadians to actually develop a global perspective in how they might, you know, do their business. But the other thing I think that international students really do as well, and I don't know that Canadians talk about this as much as they should, but students who have had a Canadian educational experience go back with a deeper understanding of Canadian values. And I think that kind of soft diplomacy is also a real strength of globalization efforts in education in Canada.
I certainly agree with you, and that's something, that's a stance that we take at Pearson College as well. We recognize both the education, homestay opportunities with host families are very important for that too. And another, one thing I think that international students have at VIU that they may not have at other post-secondary institutions is quite an opportunity to interact and learn about Indigenous cultures and communities. And obviously, a lot of people here in British Columbia know about your university's strong continuing commitment to supporting education for students from Indigenous cultures and communities. I know that commitment preceded your tenure, but can you tell us a little bit about VIU's, why they chose that path and how it's evolved in the past few years?
Well, and in fact, that was one of the reasons, that commitment to Indigenous communities, learning and knowledge was part of my attraction to coming here, as well as an opportunity to return home. Those of you who've met me know that I have a strong family connection to the island, and actually did 2 of my 3 degrees at the University of Victoria because of that. Part of the real attraction was not just to come home, as it were, but to really work with a group of people who have actually really tried to answer the calls of the TRC and implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that was a real draw for me, and we're going to actually in the new strategic plan that we hope to get approved this spring. And let me tell you, strategic planning in a pandemic is a task, but we'll actually deepen that commitment to try and really meaningfully engage with Indigenous knowledge in what is essentially a quintessential colonial instrument, right? It's probably, I would argue, one of the most successful colonial instruments, the university. And so to try and actually deepen that commitment and come to a meaningful understanding of Indigenous knowledges and really provide those opportunities for learning for all of our learners is at the heart of what we do at VIU. Why did we do it? Well, I think again, being an access institution, we recognize the transformational nature of education and the fact that we need to democratize education, right? So for kids like mine, my daughter's 13. If she wants to go to university, it's a value that my family has, and I will move mountains to ensure that she goes to the institution that she wants to go to, assuming she's accepted. And so for me, relatively speaking, money isn't a problem. Access to transportation to get there isn't a problem. Advice on what to study isn't a problem, and that sort of thing. But for many, many, many Canadians, that's not so. It's not part of their home life or their culture, and it's not something they can imagine. And that could be because they, have been engaged with the foster care system. It may be because their parents have never imagined that for them. And so we do a large amount of work to really democratize access to education, because we know increasingly in the 21st century, education is the key to a good life, which is at the heart of what many, many Indigenous cultures, including the Métis people, the nation, I belong to the Métis Nation of Alberta, and it's at the heart, living a good life is at the heart of the value system of many Indigenous peoples. So there's that piece there too.
It should be at the heart of all of us, I hope, shouldn't it? You've, excuse me, you have a long track record, I guess, in bringing these values to the institutions that you work for. You led Grant MacEwan University, I believe, in Edmonton prior to coming to VIU. And were you able to implement those values at Grant MacEwan as well and earlier in your career?
Mm-hmm. I'm really proud of the work we did together at Grant MacEwan with the Director of Indigenous Education there. We did a large amount of work to normalize ceremony, Indigenous ceremony, particularly Treaty 6 Indigenous ceremony throughout the institution. When I arrived at MacEwan, Indigenous ceremony was not mainstream. It was something that people either did in the privacy of their offices or in 2 or 3 designated spaces. And I'm really proud of the work we did with the head of facilities and security to actually make it such that we could do Indigenous ceremony anywhere on campus, and in a respectful way, and in a way in which the elders felt was appropriate. We opened every board meeting in ceremony, and we opened every Senate meeting in ceremony. It was rare for us to do anything of any import without doing it and grounding it in ceremony appropriate to Treaty 6. The other thing we did at MacEwan, and again, I won't take credit for the idea. I just paid for it. As the president, you pay for stuff sometimes. But was that Terry, the director of Indigenous Education, said, what if we had a land acknowledgement at every single entrance to the university? And so you couldn't enter our university without seeing a land acknowledgement in English, a syllabic Cree, and English phonetic Cree at every single entrance. Small gesture, but again, it shows that we know where we are, we understand that we are on the land and we are of the land, and that we recognize that there were people here before. So those are some of the ways in which we really, I think, shifted the conversation.
I'm going to come back to sort of how Pearson, is sort of trying to indigenize, and I think we're on the early steps of a long journey. But in the meantime, I did want to ask you, I mean, sometimes we encounter people in academia who are a little rattled, a little intimidated when asked to incorporate Indigenous knowledge and ways of learning into their curricula. What kind of advice would you give someone in that type of position?
I always look for early adopters in things that are scary, right? Folks who are going to be the champions that will be the thought leaders for other folks to say, actually, it wasn't that bad, and it was really scary at first. I remember the first time I taught a course online, And that was way back when it was not like this. Let me tell you, there was a TV camera and a satellite transmitter, right? And it went to northern Saskatchewan. And that was really scary, but I learned an awful lot from it. So that would be an advice to folks who are looking to try and change a culture, to look for folks who are already sort of interested and intrigued, to find those pieces of low-hanging fruit. But for folks who are actually themselves a little nervous or anxious, I always give the same advice, and it's not to overwhelm the elders, but to go and speak to the elders. The elders, I was dealing with an issue before Christmas and spoke with the elders about it just a little while ago, and have another appointment to talk to it. BIU has, I think 8. I apologize if I'm wrong on that number. I know I shouldn't speak to a communications person without having my numbers straight, but I believe we have 8 elders from a variety of nations on the coastal regions who are faculty, right? So they are paid, they are given the same rights and privileges as faculty, despite them not having PhDs, right? But I would argue that being an elder is the equivalent of a PhD in Indigenous knowledge. It's peer recognized. It doesn't, it is a celebration of the accumulation of a lifetime of knowledge. So I spoke with the elders about that issue, and they gave me some really great teachings and learnings. And again, I would argue the other thing to do is to start to educate yourself. I am a neuroscientist by training. My PhD is in psychology, but that's because my discipline was just emerging as I was getting that. But so I have no formal training in Indigenous histories of Canada. It wasn't something we took when I went to elementary school. It certainly wasn't something we talked about in grade 11 history, right?
Correct.
And as a proud Métis person, I was taught that Louis Riel was a traitor and deserved to be hung, right? So that's just to put it in context for my education. And then I went into psychology and neuroscience. So I have pretty good skills as far as how to grow neurons or the kinds of things that grow new neurons, much less so about the long-lasting legacy of colonialism. So I've taken it upon myself to read extensively in the field so that I actually can do a good job, to take correction when I do something wrong. Sometimes you fall into old habits of writing, and you say something like Canada's Indigenous peoples. Well, they pre-existed Canada, these nations, and they don't belong to Canada. So putting Canada apostrophe S as if Canada owns them is not correct, right? And the first time I did that, I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't mean it that way. It was just a simple English slip up. I'm sorry, right? Say sorry. Acknowledge your error and try and learn from it. Now I have a sticky to remind myself of the places that I slip up sometimes in my writing, so that I just remember. But if you want later, I could send you an email of a couple of really great books. I don't have them here. I'm at my office at work, and so I have them at my office at home where I often sit.
I'd love to see those.
And there's one on an Indigenous style guide that's a fantastic book. Talks about ways to, write about Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledges, right? That was a correction I received a little while ago. It's saying Indigenous knowledge, says it's sort of like, it's just like one discipline, right? And there are many ways of knowing, right? And so, so trying to change, just like, I don't know if your folks are involved in this way, but a really common Canadian phrase when greeting a group of people is like, hi guys, right? It's taken me deliberate effort to learn to say, hey folks, right? Because not everybody's a guy when you're doing it, right? I still slip up, I still make mistakes, and I just sort of apologize for it and just say, sorry folks or people.
I think that's one of the keys, and I just read the other day an op-ed article by Corey Wilson.
Oh, I love Corey. I was just on a meeting with her.
She wrote an article that was published in Policy Options, and it was calling upon post-secondary educators. And the summary of that article was 2 words: courage and humility. So be brave. Don't be afraid to say you're sorry.
Yeah, and again, if you don't know something, ask, right? I
Mhm.
mean, if you want to know, if you want to ask an elder a favor in Treaty 6, I know how to tell you how to help that. That's my life. That's where I've grown up. That's where I understand the protocols. And I explicitly asked before going to meet Chief Wise here in Snuneymuxw. I specifically asked the director of Indigenous education here, like, what is the protocol for going to meet the chief? Do I do this and this and this, which is what I
Mhm.
would do in Edmonton, or and she's like, whoa, that's kind of huge. I'm like, well, we Métis are gift giving people, and she's like, I think he'd be a little freaked out. Why don't you take him some jam or something like that? If you have to take him, so I was like, I have to take him something. So but just ask too. If you don't know the answer, ask.
Absolutely. I laugh at the Métis references. I grew up in Treaty 1, Winnipeg territory. So I've at least seen the arc of Louis Riel becoming the villain of the prairies to Louis Riel Day and being marked in Manitoba every February. So
Yeah.
there's been a degree of progress, I guess, in that respect. Let me take it back very briefly to your Pearson days,
Yeah.
if you don't mind. So how did you find out about the UWC? How did you find out about Pearson?
Well, I found out about it in grade 9 from a friend of mine, Carol, whose sister Karen Antrobus was at Pearson College. And when she came home at Christmas time, I was hanging out with my friend Carol, of course, and she had interesting friends come home with her at Christmas, and I just was like, wow, I really want to do this. Well, it was accidental, I think. I was I thought I was well on the way to becoming a basketball star. My knees now complain about that poor decision making when I was 14. But that's how I found out about it, was through friends.
How was your time at Pearson? Pearson on the unceded territory of the Chiano First Nation, which is probably not something that was discussed, I guess, at the time that you were there.
No, no, it was not discussed at all at that time. And I would say that even uh, how to frame this. At the time, remember, think back to year 10, right? 85.
85.
The Daniels decision hadn't come through, right? We're still 30 years out, 30 and change years out from the Daniels decision. And so the Métis people were not considered Indigenous people either,
Mm-hmm.
necessarily. And so even my identity, although I knew I was a Métis person, even at Pearson, my identity as an Indigenous person of Canada, what was not discussed in any way, shape, or form, nor were the few Indigenous students that we had. I'm thinking of two of my friends, Kim and Evan, who were from Cleaman
Mm-hmm.
over in Pal River, which is where we have one of our campuses at VIU. People knew they were Indigenous, but I don't think anybody discussed what did that actually mean,
Right.
or what were their nation's efforts in trying to obtain treaty, which their chiefs were absolutely trying to deal with treaty back in those days. They weren't successful until just recently, but I mean, they were absolutely a political force. Cleaman absolutely was. And I don't think we ever had any discussions about those kinds of issues at all. We were far more, I remember 85, we were far more worried about South Africa,
Yes.
um, I remember large discussions about American politics,
Mm-hmm.
and about would communism actually fail, right? In the USSR at the time, right?
Sounds so Cold War.
Right?
Yeah, a
And it was
different era. Yeah,
85. Holy smokes, hey! You think
I know.
if you look at cultural references, the Cold War is like the 50s. This is the 80s, right?
Well, we have this discussion often at Pearson because we're named after Lester Pearson, who won a Nobel Prize in 1957, who was one of the individuals who helped defuse the Cold War. And we're sort of looking at ourselves and how do we reinvent ourselves as a campus in a completely new era that has kind of left the Cold War behind, but is facing ever more greater challenges. And,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm happy to say that there are a handful of Indigenous students on campus, and it varies from year to year at Pearson. But I know that they are political forces in their own right. One of our students is a member of the young people who are suing the federal government about climate change. Others are learning at Blockade at Ferry Creek, just down the road from where we are. Others are taking part in demonstrations, but pre-COVID demonstrations, at the legislature. So it's a different experience, I think, for all of us, and I hope a learning experience for people such as me, as well as everybody else on campus. I know that you've briefly had a chance to meet virtually our head, Craig
Mhm.
Davis, and he may have mentioned that we're at an important juncture. We've got an Indigenous Vision and Reconciliation Action Plan, which was just finalized in November, and now we've only started this since the beginning of this year to constitute a working group so that we can implement short and long-term actions. I wouldn't ask you to comment on the plan at all. You may not be familiar with it, but what advice in general would you give to an educational institution that is embarking on this path that has had a number of excellent relationships with Indigenous people in the region, in the area, but have been mostly individual based as opposed to institutionally based?
I'd give you this advice, and it's I'm going to hopefully quote, but maybe only paraphrase a friend of mine, Paul Davidson, who's the head of Universities Canada, and he says that we tend to overestimate what we can get done in 1 year and underestimate what we accomplish in 10. Um, with a 2-year program cycle, I think students sometimes overestimate what can be achieved in their tenure and then not necessarily recognize how far folks have come. Because again, the time span and the space in which you are in when you're of that age is such a different time frame. If I think about how long and how fast the time has gone, I thought it would take forever to get done my undergraduate degree, and I can't believe how fast the time has flown to get to here today. And so my advice would be keep plugging away. Know that you'll take 2 steps forward and sometimes 1 back, but hopefully not too often. And take time to reflect on what has changed over the last decade, and then plot where you want to be in 10 more, and do what you have to, because a year is really fast.
This year it seemed really fast and really slow all at the same time.
Didn't it?
I didn't it
It
though,
was,
yeah.
it was like,
Yeah.
it was a year of Mondays.
Please no, never again.
Whereas somebody said to me the other day, it was, and I agreed actually, it was a year of Sundays. Because Sunday is a day that many of us use to work at home. And it's Sunday is both a fast and a slow day. It starts off with endless possibility, and before you know it, it's dinner time.
Very, very well put. I was going to go back to your comment about strategic planning by Zoom. We actually have our first strategic planning meeting this Friday. And I'm not looking forward to that process. But I will say, though, I am excited by it because we are looking to focus on the Reconciliation Action Plan at Pearson as sort of being the main pillar of what our next 5-year strategic plan is going to encompass. So without trying to sell anyone on how wonderful we are doing this, your point about taking steps, understanding that you can't do it all in a week, a month, a year is very, very well taken. I know that time grows short, and I'm going to make it late for your next meeting probably. So I just wanted to say, is there anything else you'd like to say, like to pass on to Pearson alumni?
No, just I guess the thing I would say is maybe to current students or students who are thinking about it, if I can do it, anybody can. I wasn't the best student, I wasn't the worst, but I wasn't the best by a long shot. And I just found my passion and I followed it. And then to other alumni, way to go. We got through the other side, and I look out at folks and who are alumni of any of the UWCs, and I'm just so impressed with how folks who have been touched by this experience are changing the world for the better.
Absolutely. And I have one last question for you. In reading some of your blogs and online articles as well, I thought it would be important to ask, have you learned to surf yet?
No,
Remember, small steps. You can't do it all in a year. So you've got time.
I do. I do. You know, I can boogie board like nobody's business now, but I haven't. I'm a little scared, right? Like this goes to our earlier point. I like, do I have enough core strength and the amount of time you have to get on the wave and get up to actually do that without falling on my face? Every summer we promise we're going to do it, and this will be our third summer here, so maybe this summer.
Okay, I wish you the best of luck in that. And
Thank you.
thank you so much, Deb, for taking the time to talk with us. It's been a lot of fun, and I wish you continued success in your career. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you. Thank you so much for the time. And if I can be of service, don't hesitate to reach out. I only have this much power, so only tiny problems. But if I can be of service to anyone, please don't hesitate.
Certainly appreciate it. We certainly will look forward to welcoming you on campus when it's safe to do so.
Thank you. Looking forward to coming back.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye then.
Take care.
All right.